Have you ever heard of a war where the main enemies never fired a single shot directly at each other, yet it resulted in the deaths of millions and kept the entire world on the brink of annihilation for decades? This wasn't a work of fiction. This was the Cold War, a global ideological battle that raged from 1947 to 1991, pitting two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, against each other. It was a conflict fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the shadows, through proxy wars, espionage, technological races, and a constant, terrifying nuclear standoff. So, how did this strange, silent yet deadly conflict begin? What were its most dangerous moments? And how did it finally come to an end? Let's dive into the chilling history of the Cold War. Our story begins in the ashes of World War II. The Allied powers, led by the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, had defeated Nazi Germany, but their alliance was fragile. Deep ideological rifts separated the democratic, capitalist West from the communist, totalitarian East. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, sought to create a buffer zone of communist states in Eastern Europe to protect itself from future invasions. The United States, on the other hand, feared the spread of communism, seeing it as a threat to freedom and global stability. This fundamental clash of values set the stage for conflict. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman announced what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. He pledged to support any nation resisting communist takeover. This was an official declaration of the Cold War. America would contain communism, not by directly attacking the USSR, but by propping up its allies and preventing the red tide from advancing. One of the first major tests of this new policy came in Germany. After the war, Germany and its capital, Berlin, were divided into four occupation zones controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1948, the Soviets, hoping to force the Western powers out of Berlin, blockaded all land and water access to the city's western sectors. The people of West Berlin were trapped, cut off from food, fuel, and supplies. The West faced a dilemma: give up Berlin or risk a direct military confrontation. They chose a third option, the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering millions of tons of supplies to the besieged city. It was a monumental logistical feat and a huge propaganda victory for the West. The Soviets eventually lifted the blockade, but the crisis solidified the division of Europe. The continent was now split by an Iron Curtain, a term famously coined by Winston Churchill. The lines were drawn, and both sides began to form powerful military alliances. In 1949, the United States and its Western European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Its core principle was collective defense. An attack on one member was an attack on all. The message to Moscow was clear: don't even think about invading Western Europe. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 by creating its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which included its Eastern European satellite states. The world was now formally divided into two armed camps, each glaring at the other across a heavily fortified border. But the real terror of the Cold War wasn't just about conventional armies. It was about the bomb. The atomic bomb. The US had been the sole nuclear power since 1945, but that monopoly ended in 1949 when the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic device. This kicked off the most terrifying arms race in human history. Both superpowers began stockpiling thousands of nuclear weapons, each more powerful than the last. They developed hydrogen bombs, 1,000 times more destructive than the bombs dropped on Japan. They built long-range bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, capable of delivering nuclear warheads anywhere on the planet in under an hour. This created a new, horrifying strategic doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was simple: if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with overwhelming force, ensuring the complete annihilation of both nations. This balance of terror, paradoxically, kept the peace between the superpowers, but it meant humanity was living on a knife's edge, just one miscalculation away from apocalypse. While the nuclear race escalated on Earth, another competition was taking off into the heavens, the space race. In 1957, the world was stunned when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. This small, beeping sphere was a massive technological and propaganda victory for the USSR. It suggested that if they could put a satellite in orbit, they could certainly drop a bomb on Washington, D.C. America was shocked into action. The government poured billions into science and education and created NASA. The race was on. The Soviets scored another first in 1961 when Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. But the ultimate prize was the moon. In a famous 1962 speech, President John F. Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. After years of incredible innovation and sacrifice, that promise was fulfilled on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. America had won the space race, a symbolic victory in the larger ideological struggle. While the superpowers avoided direct conflict, they fought brutal proxy wars across the globe. These were conflicts where the US and USSR supported opposing sides, turning local civil wars into international flashpoints. The first major proxy war was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. When Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviets, and China, invaded pro-Western South Korea, the United States led a United Nations coalition to push them back. The war ended in a bloody stalemate, with the country still divided today at the 38th parallel. Over 2 million people, mostly civilians, died. An even longer and more divisive conflict was the Vietnam War. Starting in the mid-1950s, the U.S. supported the anti-communist government of South Vietnam against the Communist North and its Viet Cong allies in the South. What began with a few military advisors escalated into a full-scale war involving over 500,000 American troops. The jungle warfare was brutal, and the conflict became deeply unpopular back home, sparking massive protests. Despite immense American firepower, the Communists, fueled by nationalist fervor and Soviet and Chinese aid, could not be defeated. In 1975, 2 years after the U.S. withdrew its last combat troops, North Vietnam conquered the South, unifying the country under communist rule. The war cost the lives of nearly 60,000 Americans and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians. It was a humiliating defeat for the United States and a powerful symbol of the limits of its power. Another devastating proxy war unfolded in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. The U.S., seeing an opportunity to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, began covertly funding and arming the Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen. For 10 years, the mighty Soviet army found itself bogged down in a grueling guerrilla war against determined, religiously motivated fighters in a harsh, mountainous terrain. The war drained the Soviet economy and demoralized its military. The Bear Trap, as it was called, proved fatal. In 1989, the Soviets humiliatingly withdrew their troops, leaving Afghanistan in a state of civil war that would eventually give rise to the Taliban. Throughout the Cold War, Berlin remained a focal point of tension. By the late 1950s, millions of East Germans had fled to the prosperous, democratic West Berlin. A brain drain that was embarrassing and economically damaging for the communist regime. To stop the exodus, in the dead of night on August 13, 1961, East German authorities began constructing a wall, a massive concrete barrier complete with barbed wire, guard towers, and a deadly death strip. The Berlin Wall became the most potent physical symbol of the Iron Curtain and the oppression of the communist world. The single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War came in October 1962. An American spy plane discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. These missiles could strike major American cities within minutes. President Kennedy responded by ordering a naval quarantine, a blockade, of Cuba to prevent more missiles from arriving. For 13 terrifying days, the world held its breath as Soviet ships sailed towards the American blockade line. A single mistake, A single shot fired could have triggered an all-out nuclear war. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations took place. In the end, a deal was struck. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over. The world had stared into the abyss and, thankfully, stepped back. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in deep trouble. Its centrally planned economy was stagnant, unable to keep up with the West's technological and consumer boom. The disastrous war in Afghanistan had bled it dry, and a renewed arms race initiated by U.S. President Ronald Reagan, including the ambitious Star Wars missile defense program, threatened to bankrupt the USSR. Change was desperately needed. In 1985, a new, younger leader came to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev recognized that the system was failing and introduced two radical new policies. The first was glasnost, meaning openness, which allowed for greater freedom of speech and criticism of the government. The second was perestroika, or restructuring, a series of reforms aimed at revitalizing the stagnant economy. Gorbachev's reforms had an electrifying effect, not just inside the Soviet Union, but across Eastern Europe. For decades, these nations had been held in the Soviet orbit by force. Now, seeing the new tolerance from Moscow, people began to demand change. In 1989, a series of largely peaceful revolutions swept across the Eastern Bloc. Poland elected a non-communist government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. And then, the unthinkable happened. On November 9, 1989, faced with massive protests, the East German government announced that its citizens were free to cross the border. That night, joyous crowds swarmed the Berlin Wall, dancing, singing, and tearing it down with sledgehammers and their bare hands. The most powerful symbol of the Cold War had fallen. The collapse was swift. One by one, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe crumbled. Inside the Soviet Union itself, Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed nationalist forces that he could no longer control. The various republics that made up the USSR began declaring their independence. After a failed coup attempt by hardline communists in August 1991, the Soviet Union effectively ceased to exist. On Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that was no more. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. The end of the Cold War reshaped the world map and ushered in a new era. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. But the legacy of this 40-year struggle is complex. It was a period of immense fear and paranoia, but also one of incredible technological advancement. It fueled devastating wars but also, through the terror of man, prevented a direct great power conflict. It reminds us how easily ideological differences can escalate into global confrontation, and how close we came to self-destructs. The story of the Cold War is a vital, cautionary tale for our own time. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating and dangerous periods. If you found this video informative, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next historical exploration. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of the Cold War do you find most interesting? Until next time, stay curious.